Welcome to an all-new episode of The History Gal. I'm your host, Christine Morgan, and as you can see, we've hit the road this week and we are coming to you from Washington, D.C. This episode is all about the Templars, an international order of knights who fought during the Crusades. And with the help of our very special guest, author and historian Dan Jones, we'll help you learn about how the Templars came to be and ultimately how they fell. Stay tuned as we unravel fact from fiction and chat about the myths and legends that have followed the Templars for centuries. That I saw you, it was pre-release of your brand new book, The Templars.
It was also pre-launch of the History Gal.
It was, you're right.
So two big things have happened.
We both had two very pivotal moments, right? But let's set the scene for the story. Talk to me about our time period here and where we're focusing geographically.
Okay, so in short, we're dealing with the period just after the First Crusade. So the book starts in 1102, and that's really the beginning of the Templars. 1119, 1120 is the establishment of the Templars in Jerusalem. And the book kind of draws to a finish with the end of the Templars in France and across Europe, but focused on France, between 1307 and 1312 to 1314. So we've got about 200 years of history to deal with. Specifically, the idea for the Templars, insofar as we know, came from Hugh de Pan, a man from the Champagne region of France, as so many Templars were, who pitched up in Jerusalem sometime after the First Crusade. And he got together with he and his buddies hung out at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right in the heart of Jerusalem. And they kind of decided that they ought to maybe put their talents as knights, as trained fighters, to good use in escorting pilgrims around the holy sites. And then they had the idea that they would take vows of charity and live a sort of quasi-monastic, religiously professed existence while they did this.
Right.
So that's really, in relatively short order, the beginnings of the Templars.
Sure. What is the general draw for a person to go from being a military person to being in an order that's kind of religious in many ways? Within
the Crusades, sort of at the background of the Crusades was this idea that to go and kill God's enemies was not homicide, therefore a sin.
Right.
It was malicide, the killing of evil, and therefore very pleasing to God, and hurrah, hurrah, you know, and generally a good thing to do that would reduce, your torments in the afterlife.
And you had said, and you wrote it in here as well, just this process of them taking this proposal to the Pope. I would have thought, they would carry the flags of their country, or they would have been beholden to their kings. And that's not so much the case.
So, and I think what's important about that is that, and you've hit on it really, is that the Templars were not beholden to any secular jurisdiction, to any king, to any prince, to any baron, to any whatever, or indeed to any archbishop, patriarch, except for the Pope. They were free, more or less, to rove across boundaries, to have their own structures of organisation, sort of to do as they pleased.
Yeah.
I mean, in theory.
Right. And what I think is really interesting about the story of the Templars is that it's not all uphill.
If anything, it's mostly downhill.
Specifically, I really enjoyed reading the part about Saladin.
Yes.
Which is when you really get into the chess game of war and strategy and how different people were trying to eliminate the Templars. Can you talk a little bit about the battle with Saladin and his armies?
They took part in the greatest battle, the biggest and the most game-changing battle of the late 12th century. It was the Battle of Hattin, the 4th of July, 1187, when Saladin's armies crushed an enormous Crusader army led by King Guy of Jerusalem And the Templars, those Templars who were not killed on the battlefield but were taken prisoner, were brought before Saladin. And so we have this rather grotesque and gruesome but dramatically quite powerful scene recorded by people from Saladin's entourage, in which he lined up all his about 200 Templars and Hospitallers, and had them beheaded one by one, but not by professional swordsmen, by his religious advisors and members of his entourage. Saladin thought the best way to wipe out the Templars and the Hospitallers was to kill them, to kill their members. And he got it wrong, because what was important about the Templars was not the individual members, it was their ability to recruit, their popularity, and that popularity sprang from their, in medieval terms, timelessly appealing brand values, their core values of poverty, chastity and obedience, and their reputation for being the fiercest fighters and the sort of coolest, hardest guys around. So Saladin killed a lot of Templars on the battlefield, lined up and beheaded a load of Templars at his court, and guess what? Within a few years, it was like whack-a-mole. They were all back up.
So it wasn't all beheadings and losing battles. We see a really great affirmation of their power and their strength with Louis the Ninth.
Yes.
As he prepares to go on his own crusade, and he puts them in positions of power.
Okay, so Louis relied on Templars and Hospitallers to supply his army, to help him raise the ships he needed. They were given prominent positions on the battlefield. He relied on them heavily after his crusade to Damietta. So
it's interesting then that they would have such a good tie with the French monarchy, and then we get to Philip IV, and it's all gone. It just totally flips.
Yeah. No, you're quite right, and I think that's what makes the story of the end game of the Templars so shocking, is that the deadliest enemy turns out to be the person who they would have thought was the closest to them. Philip IV, Louis IX's grandson, came to the throne as a young man and was fighting 3 wars, sometimes concurrently. As we know, foreign war in any age, very expensive. Philip had a chronic need for money, and which was exacerbated by a silver shortage at the time. He was having trouble minting coin. So the way that Philip went about dealing with this was to try and find extraordinary sources of revenue. So by 1307 he took aim at the Templars, and he realised how wealthy the Templars were, because there it was right under his nose.
Yeah.
Yes, they'd been helpful to the French crown for more than 100 years, but the flip side of that was they knew exactly how wealthy the Templars were. And how adept they were at managing their lucrative property empire, how much silver was sitting in the vaults in Paris, and so on and so on. And so, on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, the sort of one of the most famous bits of Templar history begins, a dawn raid across France on every Templar house by royal officials who come bearing papers accusing the Templars of the most grotesque kind of litany of crimes. Perverted rituals of induction, spitting on the cross, trampling on images of Christ, sexual relations between brothers, worshipping false idols. If you can think of every single button you wanted to press to shock and appall, nice, decent Christian thinking in the early 14th century, it was all there in the list of accusations against the Templars.
Right. And that gives us to the infamous Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th.
It's just kind of funny because that's just one of the other myths that we associate with the Templars. And
look, I think we're talking now to a slightly broader question, which is why the Templars, right? Why
Absolutely.
are we so fascinated with the Templars? The Templars have, for a number of reasons, accrued this kind of shrouding of mystery and myth and legend that's kind of really sexy and appealing and cool. When I started writing this book, my first instinct was to take all of that and brush it off the table. And to an extent I did that because I wanted this book to be about the actual history of the Templars. But the more I worked on it, the more I came to appreciate that although I wasn't going to get into arguing about whether the Templars really had the Shroud of Turin or came from ancient Egypt, that mythology is a very important part of their history.
Yeah, and I think it's completely fascinating that they were written about while they existed. They were legends while they were in
Yes.
action. So if people buy this book, they're going to get the exact coordinates to the Holy Grail, yeah?
Yes, they are. It's
Come and get it.
Come get it. Come get your. Every reader gets a free Holy Grail.
That's perfect. Well, this is a really excellent book, and it was a real pleasure to read it. Easy to read, lots of good information. So congratulations.
Thank you for such wonderful questions.
Thanks for being here. Hi, history lovers. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's very special episode all about the Templars. And if you missed the announcement on Facebook, the Templars is the very first ever History Gal book recommendation. You can find this now online or at any major bookseller. If you haven't already, give us a like on Facebook, and then you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram to get all the latest updates and see some behind-the-scenes action. Make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel too to get new episodes as they air. Until next time, y'all have a great week.